Hello everyone and welcome to the FrameFlow channel. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Today, we are going to be discussing the movie Five Nights at Freddy's 2, 2025. The flickering neon sign of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza blasted a sickly yellow light onto the rain-slicked asphalt. Jeremy Fitzgerald, a young man whose resume hinted at a brief, perhaps ill-fated stint as a night security guard at a defunct arcade, nervously clutched the strap of his worn messenger bag. He was taking the graveyard shift at this new, updated location, a brightly colored facade, masking a familiar dread. The job posting, glimpsed during a particularly lean period following his departure from a disastrous attempt at freelance graphic design, had promised better pay than his last gig restocking shelves at a regional grocery chain. The first night unfolded with a disorienting rush of analog chaos. Gone were the heavy steel doors of the previous establishment. In here, it was all vents, music boxes, and the unnerving blank stares of the new lineup. There was Toy Freddy, looking oddly pristine, almost too clean, beside a cheerfully menacing Toy Bonnie, who seemed to possess an unsettling agility. Balloon Boy, an irritating fixture of childhood nostalgia turned nightmare fuel, piped his incessant giggles through the speakers. Jeremy, recalling the survival manuals he'd frantically skimmed online, lessons learned from the unfortunate predecessor who now haunted the local news cycle, focused his attention on the tablet. The power drain was immediate, a constant reminder of his tenuous grip on the situation. As the week progressed, the feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't just the animatronics. It was the lingering presence of the past. Phone Guy, whose recorded messages grew increasingly frantic and less helpful, spoke of the bite of '87 and the growing instability of the older models, the withered crew, hidden away in the back rooms. Jeremy, whose own father had been a failed musician who often sought solace in the solitude of late-night rehearsals, found a perverse kinship with the idea of these machines waiting in the dark, programmed for performance, but stuck in perpetual rehearsal. The introduction of the puppet Mangle, a tangled, ceiling-dwelling monstrosity that seemed to defy the very laws of mechanics, escalated the tension. Each night demanded a precise choreography of resource management, conserving the flashlight to check the main hall, winding the music box to keep the shadowed figure of Marionette at bay, and physically peering down the air ducts. There were moments, brief flashes of insight, where Jeremy thought he saw not metal and wires, but the desperate energy of restless children, an echo of the true tragedy the pizzeria sought to bury under synthetic smiles. Around Thursday, the atmosphere curdled completely. The maintenance team seemed less concerned with repair and more with concealment. Jeremy caught glimpses of blood-like stains being hastily scrubbed from the vents by unseen hands during the brief daylight hours. His motivation, initially purely financial, was slowly transforming into a desperate need to expose whatever dark secret this franchise held. He thought of the simple, honest work he craved, the kind of work where the only thing that threatened you was a deadline, not a giant, decaying rabbit mask, snapping shut inches from your face. The final shift was less a test of endurance and more an outright assault. The system overloaded. The older, more damaged units, Foxy and Bonnie, their mechanisms groaningly protesting their resurrection, seemed driven by a raw, unthinking rage. Toy Chica, missing her beak, moved with a terrifying silent purpose. Jeremy, remembering a self-defense class he'd abandoned after realizing it mostly involved yelling, used his knowledge of spatial awareness, darting from monitor to monitor, the low battery warning flashing like a strobe light in his vision. He survived the night, collapsing onto the grimy floor just as the weak dawn broke. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that precedes an official closing. He walked out, not triumphant, but hollowed out. The next morning's paperwork, he knew, would be brief. He wouldn't be back. The final image lingered, the vacant, unsettling gaze of the golden Freddy cutout near the exit, a silent sentinel promising that even if he left the pizzeria, the shadows of those flickering lights would follow him home. The morning light filtering into the pizzeria felt abrasive, exposing the grime and the sheer audacity of the night's charade. Jeremy, his throat dry and his eyes gritty from hours spent staring at digitized threat indicators, shoved the security tablet into his bag. He moved with the stiff caution of someone recovering from a physical shock, every muscle screaming in protest. This experience felt less like security work and more like participating in a bizarre, poorly scripted avant-garde play where the props were designed to kill you. He passed the main stage one last time. Toy Freddy stood frozen mid-wave, his plastic eyes reflecting the harsh overhead fluorescence. Jeremy remembered sketching caricatures of bored executives during his college internship, trying to inject some humor into corporate monotony. Here, there was no humor, only the terrifying realization that sometimes the inanimate objects are merely vessels for something older, something that feeds on routine and proximity. The phone guy's final, garbled warnings echoed in his mind, sounding less like advice and more like the ravings of a man who understood too much about the true foundation of the entertainment industry, the exploitation hidden beneath the sugarcoating. Jeremy imagined the engineers, the people who designed these sophisticated nightmares, perhaps driven by similar obsessions with perfecting a performance. Only their ambition curdled into something monstrous when mixed with tragedy. As he reached the exit, a memory surfaced. His younger sister's 10th birthday party, ruined by a malfunctioning mascot at a local fair. The sheer, inexplicable terror that something designed for joy could turn malevolent. It was a theme that seemed to cling to his entire adult life, a recurring nightmare given a mechanical shell. Outside, the air was cool, a blessed contrast to the stale, metallic heat of the office. He glanced back at the towering structure, the bold, colorful graphics now looking peeling and desperate in the morning sun. He didn't feel like a survivor. He felt like an escaped subject. He walked toward the bus stop, not bothering to wait for a final paycheck, knowing that no amount of money could compensate for the psychic toll of whispering silence punctuated by metallic shuffles in the dark. He resolved, with a certainty that settled deep into his bones, that his next career move would involve wide-open spaces, perhaps even something involving animals. Anything that didn't require him to wear a cheap polyester uniform and fear the blinking red light of a low battery indicator. The Fazbear curse, he hoped, would end with him. The walk to the bus stop was a slow-motion replay of his flight, each footstep a conscious effort to place distance between himself and that humming, cold edifice. Jeremy adjusted the thin strap of his bag, acutely aware of the phantom weight of the tablet he no longer held, the device that had been his only shield. His hands, he noticed, were deeply ingrained with grime, the kind that no amount of scrubbing would immediately erase. A physical manifestation of the contamination he felt internally. He caught sight of his reflection in a shop window, a pale, drawn face framed by hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. He looked less like the aspirant graphic designer aiming for sleek modern aesthetics and more like a prospector who had just barely clawed his way out of a collapsed mineshaft. The memory of the previous week's final, crushing night was vivid. The way Mangle had dropped from the ceiling vent, with the sickening crunch of twisting metal, its disparate parts seeming to move with independent, malicious intent. That creature, he thought, wasn't just broken. It was fundamentally wrong, a chaotic assemblage of discarded performance pieces stitched together by something dark. The phone guy's final transmission, the one where his voice had dissolved into frantic, unintelligible static, now sounded like a final, desperate act of self-immolation. Jeremy, who had always admired clarity and direct communication, felt a profound betrayal by the very concept of recorded instruction. These messages were designed to guide, but they ended up serving only as a chronicle of escalating doom. It mirrored his own struggles in life, where every attempt at clear guidance, from professors, from mentors, seemed to lead only to more ambiguous peril. He found a bench beneath an awning, waiting for the bus that would take him to a temporary, much safer cleaning job he'd lined up before the horrors of the pizzeria had fully materialized. He closed his eyes, but the darkness behind his lids was immediately populated by the glowing, vacant eyes of Toy Bonnie, whose unnervingly human posture now haunted his sleep patterns. He remembered the initial shock of seeing that animatronic move during the first night, so fluid, so deliberately designed to mimic life, yet utterly devoid of soul. It was the uncanny valley made physical, a perfect trap. As the bus finally rumbled into view, its brakes hissing a sound much more comforting than the mechanical whirring he was accustomed to, Jeremy didn't look back again. He stepped aboard, seeking the anonymity of the other passengers. Office workers, students, people engaged in the mundane dramas of the day. He carried within him the knowledge that beneath the surface of every cheerfully presented public space, there might lurk forgotten machinery, old secrets, and the restless echoes of things that should have been allowed to rest in peace. He had stared into the mechanical abyss, and for now, the abyss had blinked first. The bus interior smelled faintly of stale coffee and damp wool, a welcome assault on his senses compared to the sterile, antiseptic scent of the pizzeria's hallways, which always seemed undercut by a metallic tang of decay. Jeremy sank into a window seat, not bothering to swipe his transit card. The thought of money now utterly trivial. He focused instead on the passing landscape, the ordinary city life. A woman struggling with a stroller, a delivery truck double-parked, as anchors to a reality he had momentarily lost. His mind kept returning to the older animatronics, the withered ones. They possessed a grim authenticity that the sleek, modern toys lacked. Foxy, half-collapsed, seemed to embody the slow, painful failure of an endeavor, a fate Jeremy intimately understood from his abandoned freelance projects. There was a tragedy in their decay that felt almost noble, unlike the synthetic cheerfulness of the new models, which seemed engineered purely for deception. He reflected on how he had once sought roles that offered creative control, only to find himself drawn into systems where he was utterly powerless, reduced to reacting to programmed threats. He instinctively checked his wrists, a habit formed over the week, looking for the phantom glow of the tablet's low-power indicator. The absence of that guiding light was profoundly unsettling. He realized that for so long, his entire focus had narrowed to that small screen, reducing the complex terror of the building into manageable metrics: power percentage, remaining time, door status. Stepping away from it felt like walking blind into a storm. A young couple across the aisle laughed loudly at some shared joke, their easy camaraderie a stark contrast to the isolation Jeremy had endured in the security office. He remembered the puppet, not just as a threat that required winding the music box, but as a figure of profound, inescapable sorrow. That entity, hovering near the prizes, seemed less interested in killing him, and more interested in ensuring he understood the pervasive sadness clinging to the place. It was a sorrow that felt rooted in the unfulfilled potential of childhood fun, twisted into something vengeful. Jeremy pulled a crumpled napkin from his pocket. He hadn't realized he'd taken it from the pizzeria's lobby earlier in the week. On it, someone, perhaps a previous guard, perhaps even the phone guy during a moment of clarity, had scribbled a single shaky sentence. "They want to wear you." The ambiguity was chilling. Did they want his uniform? His body? Or just the sheer, vibrant energy of a living person to animate their cold shells? As the bus pulled away from the downtown core and headed toward the quieter residential areas, Jeremy finally allowed himself a deep, shuddering breath. The ordeal was over, but the silence within him felt brittle. He knew that if he ever saw a brightly colored logo featuring a cheerful bear again, his instinct wouldn't be curiosity, but a cold, hard panic. He was leaving the Fazbear world, but he suspected a part of the wiring that screamed warnings in the dead of night, would remain permanently installed within him. The next few weeks settled into a quiet rhythm Jeremy desperately clung to. He was working out of a small, rented storage unit, taking on simple graphic design commissions for local businesses. Logos for a dry cleaner, flyers for a neighborhood bake sale. The work was straightforward, the clients predictable, and most importantly, the lighting was always steady and fluorescent, never flickering. This deliberate engagement with the mundane was his armor. He avoided the news entirely, terrified of seeing a headline about unexplained structural collapses or perhaps a sudden, highly publicized recall of animatronic entertainment systems. Every time his cell phone buzzed, his heart executed a painful lurch, anticipating the sound of a shrill computerized giggle, or the grating feedback of a broken microphone. He started sleeping with a heavy antique brass lamp next to his makeshift desk, not for illumination, but for its solid, comforting weight. Something he could actually throw, rather than just stare at behind bulletproof glass. One afternoon, while designing a brochure for a new artisanal soap company, Jeremy noticed his usual meticulous attention to detail had fractured. He kept subconsciously aligning the soap bar graphics into rigid, perfect rows, mirroring the way he had aligned the security cameras on his tablet. Worse, when the delivery man for the art supplies knocked. A loud, insistent rap, Jeremy had reflexively dropped to the floor, pressing his back against the cold steel shelving unit, waiting for the inevitable sound of snapping jaws. The delivery man, confused, had simply left the package and retreated. This residual hypervigilance was exhausting. He found himself constantly analyzing inanimate objects. A particularly realistic mannequin in a storefront window seemed to hold a fixed, knowing smile. A vending machine's internal workings, visible through its glass, looked distressingly similar to the complex wiring diagrams he'd studied in the maintenance schematics during his third night on the job. He recognized that his mind wasn't just remembering trauma. It was recategorizing the entire visible world through the lens of the pizzeria's threat assessment. He decided he needed a cleansing ritual, something completely antithetical to the confined, manufactured horror he'd just escaped. He bought a used, inexpensive digital camera, the kind favored by hobbyist nature photographers, and began taking long, pointless excursions into the nearby state park. He focused the lens on moss growing on rocks, the intricate patterns of tree bark, the sheer, unscripted chaos of natural growth. Here, things decayed slowly, visibly, and without malice. There were no hidden mechanisms designed to lure you in, only sunlight and time. Yet, even among the towering redwoods, the silence was never absolute. Sometimes, when the wind died down completely, Jeremy could almost hear it, a faint, high-pitched whine, like a forgotten music box winding down in a distant soundproof room. He would freeze, breath held, until the ordinary sounds of the forest rushed back in, drowning out the mechanical echo. He knew, with chilling certainty, that the game wasn't truly over until he could stand in complete silence and feel nothing but the quiet rhythm of his own unthreatened heart. The forest offered a superficial balm, a temporary camouflage for the deeper fissures in Jeremy's composure. He'd traded the suffocating closeness of the pizzeria for the overwhelming scale of nature, yet the anxiety persisted, merely changing its focus. Instead of scanning vents, he now scanned the tree lines, his eyes perpetually seeking unnatural angles or movement that defied the gentle sway of the branches. His camera, initially a tool for reconnection, was increasingly used to document anomalies, a strangely uniform cluster of fungi, a perfectly circular shadow cast by a broken branch, as if he could catalog and thus control the intrusion of the artificial into the organic. His professional work suffered because of this internal editing process. Designing a logo for a bakery required conveying warmth and homemade authenticity, but Jeremy found himself instinctively adding subtle, almost invisible outlines around the baked goods, geometric boundaries suggesting containment. His client, a kindly older woman named Mrs. Henderson, gently pointed out that the bread looked slightly trapped. Jeremy mumbled an apology, recalling the way Toy Bonnie was always framed perfectly in the center of the stage, an image of captured, forced joy. One rainy Tuesday, while editing photographs of ferns, Jeremy stumbled upon a small, almost imperceptible glitch in the digital file, a single line of corrupted pixels spanning across the image of a decaying log. It was minuscule, easily dismissed as sensor noise, but to Jeremy, it looked exactly like the static interference that had plagued the security monitor just before Mangle lunged. He spent 3 hours trying to isolate and delete that line, his fingers trembling, the old survivalist instinct taking over. Eradicate the threat before it propagates. He tried to articulate some of this to a new acquaintance, Sarah, a barista he met who shared his appreciation for obscure European cinema. He spoke vaguely about a stressful prior job involving long hours and mechanical stress, careful to omit the blood and the screaming metal. Sarah, empathetic from her own experiences dealing with demanding film festival organizers, listened patiently. But when Jeremy paused, searching for the right words to describe the feeling of being hunted by something that shouldn't exist, he could only manage. It felt like being forced to watch a play where everyone else knew the ending but me. Sarah, perhaps drawing inspiration from the very German expressionist films they admired, suggested immersion therapy of a sort. You need to overwrite the tapes, Jeremy. Go somewhere loud, vibrant, and completely devoid of darkness. She proposed a trip to the city's largest, busiest indoor marketplace, a kaleidoscope of commerce, noise, and human interaction. The idea terrified him, yet the suffocating solitude of the storage unit was becoming its own kind of prison. He agreed, seeing it as one last, necessary confrontation with the visible, living world, hoping that the sheer volume of normal activity might finally drown out the persistent, faint whine of a far-off music box. The marketplace was a cacophony that assaulted Jeremy's carefully constructed quietude. It was everything the pizzeria wasn't. Brightly lit, teeming with unpredictable movement, and utterly commercial, yet blessedly non-malevolent. Sarah navigated the crowded aisles with easy confidence, pointing out stalls selling handcrafted jewelry and exotic spices. Jeremy, however, felt like a fish launched onto a dusty floor. Every vendor shouting prices, every child dropping a dropped toy, felt like a potential cue for a threat sequence. He focused intently on Sarah, using her relaxed posture and genuine engagement as a shield. She was studying a display of intricate, hand-painted ceramic tiles, remarking on the vibrant blues. Jeremy tried to engage, to comment on the glaze quality, but his internal monologue was stuck on analyzing the ceiling structure. Were the ventilation shafts adequate? Could something small and agile climb them? He caught himself involuntarily looking toward the far end of the hall where the food court began, half expecting to see a familiar, slightly too tall figure gliding silently through the crowd. The sensory overload eventually began to work. The sheer density of normal human activity, haggling, laughing, the rhythmic chopping of a nearby food stall, started to create a buffer. He noticed a street performer setting up a small, battery-operated drum kit, a piece of cheap plastic machinery that seemed perfectly harmless. He stared at it, not with fear, but with a strange, detached clinical interest. It was built to create noise, not to hide malevolence. Later, sitting over lukewarm coffee, Sarah recounted a disastrous early attempt at directing a student short film, where the lead actor had suffered a complete breakdown backstage, convinced the camera lens was spying on his thoughts. Jeremy found himself nodding along, recognizing the shared experience of having one's inner world violently breached by an external, unresponsive mechanism. "It's the control," he finally said, his voice raspy from disuse. "When you realize you can't predict the mechanism, you lose the script entirely." He decided to test his boundaries. Spotting a kiosk selling novelty toys, he walked toward it purposefully. Among the cheap plastic keychains and bobbleheads, he saw a small, crude plush version of a yellow bear, vaguely familiar in its roundness. He picked it up. The stuffing felt soft, non-threatening. He squeezed it, expecting the usual surge of adrenaline. Instead, he felt a strange surge of pity. This was the residue of the horror, stripped of its wires and programming, just inert fluff. He bought the toy, paying with bills retrieved from the wallet he'd nervously kept hidden since leaving the pizzeria. Walking out of the market into the bright afternoon sun, Jeremy held the plush bear loosely in his hand. It wasn't a trophy, nor a constant reminder, but perhaps a piece of excised scar tissue. He hadn't defeated the fear, but he had successfully navigated a space designed for human interaction without reverting to the survival crouch. The memory of the pizzeria remained, a permanent shadow on his psyche, but for the first time in months, he felt a slight, tentative shift in direction, away from the dark, toward the noise. He still flinched when the car horns blared, but he didn't drop to the pavement. That, he realized, was a victory worth noting, even if it was documented only in the pages of his own weary mind. The plush bear, tucked into the corner of his makeshift workspace now, served as a strange, silent companion. Jeremy found himself occasionally turning it over in his hands while reviewing design drafts, the soft fabric a counterpoint to the sharp edges of the monitor. The rhythm of his days stabilized further, He even started keeping slightly later hours, fueled by a cautious optimism rather than sheer terror. He began accepting invitations from Sarah to small, quiet gallery openings, events where the art was abstract and required interpretation, demanding mental engagement rather than simple vigilance. During one such evening, surrounded by muted colors and hushed conversation, Sarah mentioned she was volunteering at a local community center, helping organize a children's talent show. The words "children" and "talent show" sent a cold spike of recognition through Jeremy, but he forced himself to maintain eye contact with her. He inquired, not about the performers, but about the logistics, the stage setup, the sound system. He needed details, the framework that held the performance together, because the framework was the only part he felt he could understand now. Sarah explained that they were short-staffed and needed someone reliable for technical oversight, managing the microphones, making sure the lighting cues hit at the right moment. The suggestion hung in the air, fraught with unintended irony. Jeremy, the man who had spent a week dodging homicidal robots, was being asked to manage a spotlight for 8-year-olds singing off-key. The internal debate raged. His instinct screamed danger at the mere mention of a venue designed for public entertainment. But a different, more insistent voice, the one that had forced him through the horrors of the withered night, whispered about control and reprogramming. If he could face the manufactured terror of Fazbear's, perhaps he could handle the controlled, benevolent chaos of a genuine, non-threatening stage. It was a deliberate act of exposure therapy, a conscious decision to re-enter a controlled performance space on his own terms. He accepted. The following Saturday, armed with a basic soundboard and a sheaf of printed cues, Jeremy stood backstage in the community hall. The air smelled of dust, cheap plastic decorations, and nervous perspiration, a far cry from the oil and rust he was used to. He watched the young performers wobble onto the stage. A girl practicing a hesitant piano piece, a pair of boys attempting a very earnest, very awkward magic act. When the little girl struggled with a difficult chord change, Jeremy instinctively reached for the soundboard, ready to subtly boost the microphone so her voice wouldn't be completely lost. He didn't hesitate. The action was automatic, born of his need to ensure the smooth running of the show, to make sure the performance didn't collapse into failure. He realized then that his skills, honed under duress, weren't entirely useless. They were just misapplied. He wasn't guarding against murder. He was guarding against a missed note. As the evening concluded, and the small audience applauded genuinely, Jeremy felt a weight lift that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. The applause wasn't forced or mechanical. It was warm, imperfect, and earned. He packed up his small toolkit, the rubber soles of his shoes squeaking lightly on the polished floor. As he locked the hall's supply closet, he noticed the large, slightly faded poster advertising last year's show. A cartoonishly cheerful mascot smiling out at the viewer. This time, however, the smile didn't feel like a threat. It just looked like bad graphic design. The ease with which he managed the talent show, the simple satisfaction of technical execution, felt almost revolutionary. Jeremy found himself sketching again, not the sleek corporate logos of his past, but designs for stage lighting setups. Bold washes of color meant to highlight emotion, not obscure threats. He even started incorporating the concept of fading out gracefully into his designs, a stark contrast to the abrupt, violent endings that had characterized his previous employment. Sarah, observing this shift, suggested he apply his newfound focus to something more ambitious, designing the visual aesthetic for a small, independent theater group that specialized in absurdist plays. This proposition both thrilled and terrified him. Absurdism, the deliberate juxtaposition of the mundane and the meaningless, felt perilously close to the logic of the pizzeria itself, but at least here, the absurdity was intentional, not accidental. He accepted, provided he could work entirely remotely and have absolute control over the lighting schematics. His first contribution to the play, a minimalist set utilizing only stark white cycloramas and moving shadow projections, was met with cautious excitement by the director, an intense, chain-smoking woman named Vivian, who had an almost cult-like devotion to minimalism. Vivian, who believed that true emotion only emerged when excess was stripped away, unknowingly echoed the primal, stripped-down horror Jeremy had experienced. Jeremy spent days perfecting the shadow play. He was meticulous about the angle of the single, powerful spotlight, ensuring that the shadows cast by the actors were elongated, distorted, almost threateningly large, a projection of internal dread made external. He understood distortion now. He knew precisely how far an object could be stretched before it became unrecognizable and frightening. One evening, reviewing the light cues late at night in his storage unit sanctuary, he received a text message from an unknown number. It was a low-resolution image, a slightly crumpled, heavily used napkin, identical to the one he'd found at Fazbear's. On it, scrawled in faint pencil, was a single word: "Still here." The blood immediately drained from his face. He scrambled for the brass lamp, ready to smash the computer screen, ready to run. But then, the training from the community center kicked in. He paused, forcing his breathing to slow, analyzing the input rather than reacting to it. It was a low-resolution image. It could have been sent by anyone. It was designed to provoke that exact crippling panic he'd felt every night at 3 a.m. on the job. He took a photo of the plush yellow bear sitting on his desk, positioning it so the harsh desk lamp cast a long, clear shadow across the wall. He sent this new image, the symbol of his tentative recovery, back to the unknown number. He didn't wait for a reply. He deleted the incoming message thread, shut down his computer, and then, with deliberate slowness, he walked over to the ventilation shaft in the corner of the storage unit, a relic from when he first moved in, and taped a thick piece of insulating foam over the grate. It wasn't to keep things out. It was to keep the potential noise of the outside world from filtering in. He was no longer just avoiding the darkness. He was consciously building a sanctuary against the echo of its influence. The theater awaited. But first, he needed a few more nights of perfectly controlled, human-generated silence. The deliberate muffling of the vent was more for psychological reassurance than actual security. Jeremy understood that the true infiltration wasn't through physical means anymore. It was the insidious logic of fear that had colonized his mind. He began designing the theater's lighting not just as shadow play, but as a mechanism to control anxiety. If the stage felt too static, too still, he'd introduce a slow, almost imperceptible flicker in the background wash, just enough to simulate the electrical strain of the old pizzeria, but calibrated so carefully that it remained aesthetically pleasing rather than threatening. His work for the theater troupe became a strange form of emotional mastery. Vivian loved the way his shadows made the actors seem larger, more tormented than they actually were. She praised his control over the negative space, unaware that Jeremy was mapping out the precise boundaries of his own psychological safe zone. One evening, while calibrating the spotlight intensity for a particularly dramatic monologue about existential dread, Jeremy received an email. It wasn't a threat, but a job application forwarded by Sarah. It was for a technical directorship position at a renowned, albeit small, experimental film studio known for pushing boundaries in visual effects and atmosphere. The required portfolio highlighted strong skills in environmental control and managing complex, mood-altering technologies, skills Jeremy now undeniably possessed. The studio specialized in creating seamless, immersive digital environments. This was the ultimate iteration of what he'd done at Fazbear's, but now, he would be the programmer, not the subject. He had years of experience creating the illusion of life and menace within rigid technical frameworks. His resume, heavily edited to remove any mention of pizza, now focused on advanced spatial threat assessment and low-power resource optimization under extreme duress. He interviewed via video link, feeling remarkably calm. When the lead producer asked about his most challenging project, Jeremy didn't hesitate. He spoke about a high-stakes, long-term installation where the integrity of the system was constantly undermined by internal, uncatalogued elements, requiring split-second decisions based on minimal sensory data. He described the intense pressure of maintaining performance integrity when the power supply itself was unstable. He framed the entire ordeal as a masterclass in reactive systems management. He got the job. It required him to move across the country, leaving the familiar quiet of his storage unit and the supportive, yet slightly naive, comfort of Sarah's world behind. The move felt less like an escape and more like an advanced deployment. He was taking his hard-won, terrifying expertise to a place where it was finally valued, albeit for the wrong reasons. As he packed the last box, he picked up the plush yellow bear. He didn't feel the urge to throw it away or hide it. He placed it carefully on the passenger seat of his old car, next to his keys. It was no longer a trophy of survival, but perhaps a benchmark, a physical reminder of the baseline level of fear he was now capable of surviving. He looked back once at the storage unit door, then pulled out onto the highway, driving toward the massive, complex digital stages where the monsters were now made of light and code, and where, finally, Jeremy was holding the switch. The cross-country drive was a slow, deliberate decompression. Jeremy found the sheer monotony of the interstate highway deeply soothing. Miles dissolved one after another, each one a concrete confirmation that he was moving forward, away from the fixed geography of his nightmare. The plush bear remained on the passenger seat, its fixed painted eyes observing the passing landscape, no longer seeming to judge or threaten, but simply to exist as a static data point. The new studio was housed in a sprawling, modern building that felt aggressively open. Vast expanses of glass and high ceilings that offered no shadows deep enough to conceal anything sinister. His new office was spacious, equipped with banks of high-definition monitors, displaying complex simulations of alien landscapes and futuristic cityscapes. The air was climate-controlled, pristine, and blessedly free of the metallic tang of old machinery. His initial tasks involved designing the atmospheric rendering for a deep space exploration game, the visual behavior of nebulae, and the subtle degradation of hull plating under cosmic radiation. It was complex, requiring an artist's eye blended with an engineer's precision, a perfect marriage of his initial aspirations and his recent brutal education. He excelled at simulating decay, the way light hits stressed metal, the slow diffusion of color from old screens, because he had studied degradation up close. The technical team at the studio regarded him with a mixture of awe and slight intimidation. He spoke fluently about frame rates, latency, and the psychological impact of screen refresh rates, referencing concepts he'd learned by watching his own life ebb away on a security monitor. When a junior designer struggled to make a digital storm look sufficiently menacing, Jeremy stepped in. He adjusted the particulate density, increased the variance in the simulated electrical arcs, and introduced a fractional, barely perceptible visual jitter to the lighting effects. "It needs to feel like the system is about to fail," he explained calmly, "but just manage to hold it together. That tension, that's what sells the reality." The junior designer stared at the screen, amazed, having accidentally witnessed a masterclass in manufacturing dread. Jeremy's social life remained deliberately muted. He exchanged polite, professional emails with Sarah, sharing occasional, non-specific updates about the weather at his new location. He avoided any deep personal connection, viewing emotional vulnerability as another potential opening for an external system to compromise his equilibrium. He ate most of his meals at his desk, focusing on high-protein, low-fuss options, minimizing variables in his daily routine. There was, however, one persistent flicker of the past. During long rendering tests, when the office quieted down, and the only sound was the whirring of the cooling fans, Jeremy sometimes found himself adjusting the studio's ambient white noise generator. He would slowly dial down the programmed sounds of gentle rain and soft wind, replacing them with a very low-frequency, almost subsonic hum. It was the approximate sound profile of the pizzeria's ventilation system, running at minimum power. A sound he knew intimately, a sound that now registered not as a threat, but as the sound of stability. It was the sound of being exactly where he was supposed to be, managing the illusion, safely behind the console. He had not escaped the machine. He had simply learned how to program it. He looked at the yellow bear sitting on his pristine desk, a relic from a dark age, and felt a final strange sense of closure. The nightmare had forged him into something unexpectedly specialized, a visual architect of tension. He began working on the next asset, a digital environment for a grand, silent void. And for the first time in a long time, Jeremy felt not like a victim, but like the sole, necessary operator. The transition from surviving the pizzeria's mechanical malice to designing digital menace was seamless, almost terrifyingly so. Jeremy discovered that the intense, focused paranoia he'd developed over that single dreadful week was an immensely valuable asset in the world of high-end visual effects. Fear, when contained and quantified, became a marketable aesthetic. He began to view his past trauma as specialized field research. When the lead producer, Marcus, requested that the stars in the new space simulation look unnervingly vast and empty, Jeremy didn't need reference photos. He needed only to recall the moment he realized the lights had gone out permanently on night 3. He knew the exact shade of black that consumed all peripheral vision, the depth that implied not distance, but finality. He coded in subtle, barely perceptible fluctuations in the background radiation, rendering the void with a sense of active, suffocating presence, a silence that felt heard. His reputation solidified quickly. He became known for his unsettling realism. Other designers, struggling to achieve believable horror in their digital landscapes, would watch Jeremy work. He never yelled or expressed frustration. He simply adjusted parameters with the detached precision of a surgeon working on his own ghost. He rarely engaged in office gossip or after-work drinks, preferring the absolute solitude of his rendering suite, where the only moving things were the elements he himself had set in motion. His most pronounced physical tell was his reaction to sound. A sudden, sharp clap of thunder from a passing storm outside the studio would cause his entire body to lock up momentarily, his fingers hovering inches above the keyboard, anticipating the sound of crushing metal. But unlike before, the freeze response now quickly ceded to analysis. He would immediately check the studio's internal diagnostic logs, checking for any anomalous power draw or unexpected hardware strain, seeking a rational explanation for the sound, a process that always confirmed the source was external and harmless. This ability to self-correct, to apply technical scrutiny to panic, was his greatest triumph. One afternoon, while finalizing the texture mapping for a crumbling digital fortress, Jeremy found himself staring at his reflection in the darkened monitor screen. He looked healthier. The ashen pallor was gone, replaced by a focused intensity. But the eyes were different. They held a certain depth, a permanent shadow that hadn't been there before. He saw not just himself, but the ghost of the exhausted guard who stared back from the security feed, perpetually vigilant. He realized he was wearing the pizzeria's curse not as a uniform, but as a layer of skin. The plush bear, still riding shotgun in his car, was now slightly less pristine. During a particularly stressful rendering push, he'd absent-mindedly spilled coffee on it. He'd cleaned it as best he could, leaving a faint, brownish stain near its plastic eye. That stain, that small imperfection, felt more real, more owned, than any of the perfect digital creations he was currently building. He decided to try a new form of therapy, one that embraced the manufactured nature of his current existence. He started incorporating tiny, deliberate Easter eggs into his massive environmental builds, minute details designed only for him. In one corner of the digital nebula, he rendered a faint, pixelated outline of a stage light fixture. In the corner of the fortress's shadow, he coded a single, fleeting, horizontal shadow that mimicked the tilt of Foxy's broken jaw. These were acknowledgments, secret little winks to the architecture of his past trauma. They proved that he was in control now, able to build the things that haunted him, and then, crucially, decide when they disappeared. The Fazbear curse hadn't ended. It had simply been licensed, digitized, and repurposed for high-end entertainment. And Jeremy, the former victim, was now the chief architect of the sequel. The sophomore entry into the Five Nights at Freddy's cinematic universe, widely anticipated as Five Nights at Freddy's 2, 2025, carries the immense burden of expanding a tightly focused horror narrative while satisfying a fanbase deeply invested in esoteric lore. If this sequel successfully navigates its predecessor's established atmosphere, it will likely pivot from the contained terror of the first film, which hinged on the isolation and psychological breakdown of Mike Schmidt, a character whose backstory hinted at unresolved trauma mirroring the franchise's dark familial undertones. The casting choices, should they mirror the franchise's known trajectory, would necessitate introducing new security personnel, perhaps even exploring the perspective of a seasoned, world-weary night guard, brought in specifically because the bizarre incidents at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza are escalating beyond the scope of rookie panic. The central challenge for the writers lies in escalating the threat without diminishing the unique, almost childlike malevolence established by the original animatronics. The first film leaned heavily into practical effects, favoring tactile creepiness over pure digital spectacle. A choice that resonated strongly with longtime players. A sequel must either refine this approach, perhaps by introducing withered animatronics that look significantly more decayed and menacing, emphasizing the sheer age and suffering embedded in their metal frames, or introduce new, perhaps even more experimental, robotic entities. Rumors often circulate about the inclusion of the puppet or balloon boy. If the puppet is integrated, the thematic focus must shift from mere survival to something more deeply rooted in spiritual possession and the manipulation of innocence, echoing the narrative themes director Emma Tammy explored through the fragmented memories of the missing children. The inspiration drawn from creator Scott Cawthon's design philosophy remains paramount. Cawthon's genius lies in the mundane made monstrous. The juxtaposition of bright, primary-colored mascots against environments of rot and desperation. A successful sequel will need to replicate this tonal dissonance, perhaps by shifting the setting to a different, even more dilapidated Fazbear location. Possibly an iteration of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza Place from the second game, which already features a more expansive, open floor plan that forces the guard to manage visibility across greater distances. This spatial expansion inherently raises the stakes, moving beyond the claustrophobic security room and forcing the new protagonist into more active, albeit still stationary, defense roles. Consider the potential protagonist. If the film moves away from Mike Schmidt, the new lead might be an individual with a professional background, perhaps a former robotics engineer, or a discredited paranormal investigator, rather than just a desperate guardian trying to retain custody. This professional skepticism, slowly eroded by undeniable supernatural events, offers a richer arc than pure reactive fear. Drawing parallels to established thriller archetypes, this character might initially attempt to apply logic, testing sound frequencies, mapping ventilation shafts, only to confront antagonists like Mangle, whose chaotic, deconstructed form defies conventional mechanics and physics. The sheer visual complexity of Mangle alone demands a significant commitment to special effects integration, potentially pushing the sequel into a more action-oriented, if still suspenseful, realm. Furthermore, the sequel has the opportunity to finally delve deeper into the corporate entity behind the horror, Fazbear Entertainment. The first film treated the company primarily as a convenient narrative device for the initial tragedy. A sequel could explore the cover-ups, the legal ramifications, or even the cult-like devotion some contemporary characters might hold for the brand, viewing the disappearances as mere unfortunate business footnotes. This addition of corporate malice, perhaps personified by a shadowy board member pulling strings from afar, could add a layer of human villainy to complement the mechanical terror, aligning the story more closely with classic horror tropes concerning institutional failures and predatory capitalism, themes subtly alluded to in Cawthon's newspaper clippings and hidden game files. The film needs to ensure that while the lore deepens, the immediate visceral fear of the jump scare, that perfect moment when the camera pans away from a vent only to snap back to a looming shadow, remains untouched, preserving the core appeal that made the first outing a surprising box office success. The emotional landscape of the sequel, Five Nights at Freddy's 2, 2025, must evolve beyond the weary resignation of the first protagonist. Where Mike Schmidt navigated grief and a desperate need for stability, the new night watchman, let's imagine him as an older, perhaps recently divorced man named Arthur, seeking anonymity in the graveyard shift, should embody a kind of brittle professional detachment. Arthur, having perhaps spent years in less demanding, less emotionally resonant security work, sees this new job as merely a means to an end, a temporary financial patch. His initial interactions with the animatronics, perhaps cataloging their deterioration in the back rooms during the day shift, would be marked by professional curiosity rather than immediate terror. he might see Freddy Fazbear as just another piece of worn-out stage equipment, noting the rust spots and loose wiring with the critical eye of an engineer, ironically blind to the restless souls animating them. This slow burn of dread would be critically important. If the first film relied on the immediacy of a haunted house scenario, the sequel needs to cultivate a sense of being deliberately hunted by something intelligent. The withered animatronics, in particular, demand a performance rooted in their broken physicality. Imagine Foxy, whose exposed endoskeleton might now look less like a costume malfunction and more like deliberate, painful self-mutilation. The sound design, therefore, becomes a character in itself. The grinding screech of old gears struggling against supernatural impetus must convey effort, a strained, unholy struggle to move. Arthur's emotional trajectory would move from mild annoyance at persistent technical malfunctions to genuine cold sweat panic as he realizes the machines are learning his specific routines, adapting to his resource management of the dwindling power supply. The integration of new antagonists, like the puppet, would necessitate a deeper dive into the psychological horror of childhood tragedy, something the first film touched upon, but never fully explored in the light. If the puppet is given substantial screen time, its presence should feel less like a direct threat and more like an oppressive, sorrowful overseer of the haunting. This could manifest in moments where Arthur finds small, anachronistic objects, a single clean marble on the security desk, or a child's drawing left neatly on a monitor, suggesting a presence that wields a mournful, almost maternal authority over the others. This introduces a layer of pathos that tempers the pure adrenaline rush, forcing Arthur to confront the tragedy underpinning the chaos, rather than just fighting to survive the night. The expanded environment of the hypothetical new pizzeria, perhaps designed with multiple intersecting hallways and blind corners, mimicking the increasingly complex map layouts of the games, will amplify Arthur's feeling of vulnerability. He's no longer confined to a single glass box. He has to rely on distant cameras positioned in cavernous dining areas, creating agonizing delays between spotting a threat and reacting to it. The introduction of working ventilation shafts, frequently mentioned in game lore as escape or entry routes, would become Arthur's nemesis. Every rattling sound from the vents would trigger a deep, visceral fear of entrapment, forcing him to make split-second decisions about sealing off sections of the building, effectively sacrificing access to certain monitors or resources to buy precious seconds against an unseen approach. This forced agency, where every defensive choice has a tangible, immediate cost, is where the sequel will truly elevate the suspense beyond mere pattern recognition. It will test Arthur's professional facade, stripping away his cynicism until all that remains is the primal scream of a man realizing he is trapped inside a meticulously constructed metallic mausoleum. The success of Five Nights at Freddy's 2 hinges significantly on how effectively the sequel portrays the psychological toll on its protagonist, Arthur, especially when contrasted with the almost supernatural resilience required to face these specific horrors. Arthur's past, perhaps a failed career in law enforcement due to an incident where his over-reliance on procedure led to catastrophe, would make his current situation an ironic self-punishment. He seeks predictability, yet he is surrounded by entities that thrive on unpredictable, almost random malice. His initial composure, that brittle professional shell, should visibly crack not during a jump scare, but during the quiet moments in between. Imagine a scene where Arthur, checking the monitor showing the parts and service room, sees Bonnie standing utterly still, facing the camera, not moving for an unnervingly long stretch. The horror isn't the attack. It's the intelligent, silent observation, the sense that the machine is waiting for him to relax before striking. The visual design of the withered animatronics must communicate history through decay. If the first film showed animatronics that were merely old, the sequel needs to display entities that appear tortured. Toy Chica, for instance, might feature severe damage to her faceplate, exposing wiring that looks disturbingly like exposed nerve endings, perhaps even emitting faint electrical sparks that mimic a distressed breathing pattern. This level of detail elevates the horror from creature feature territory into body horror, filtered through robotics. The narrative could weave in brief, fragmented flashbacks for Arthur whenever he observes a particularly damaged character, perhaps triggered by a specific visual, a smear of brown resembling dried ketchup near Freddy's microphone, linking the machine's current state to the original, unseen violence that permeates the location. The expanded scope of the sequel also demands a more active management of the environment, forcing Arthur to interact with the physical space beyond the tablet. If the location is a massive multi-room establishment, perhaps a former warehouse retrofitted into a pizzeria, Arthur might be forced to manually activate secondary security measures, like powering up temporary spotlights in distant hallways or physically resetting circuit breakers in adjacent utility closets. These excursions into the dark, unmonitored zones are where the tension peaks. It is in these moments that the limitations of his resources, the dwindling battery life of his flashlight, the heavy slow-locking mechanism of a reinforced door, become tangible antagonists, more immediate threats than the animatronics themselves. The sound of a heavy deadbolt sliding home should feel like a desperate temporary victory, immediately followed by the unnerving, distant thud of something large impacting the other side of the steel. Crucially, the sequel needs to address the why of the hauntings more explicitly, perhaps through character interaction with a surviving, albeit estranged, family member of William Afton, or a long-term Fazbear employee driven mad by the secrecy. If Arthur stumbles upon hidden maintenance logs, written in frantic, almost illegible handwriting, detailing attempts to contain or even communicate with the entities, this externalizes the lore. This secondary character's input, perhaps delivered via a crackling phone call, could provide exposition about the specific programming glitches or the spiritual tethering mechanisms, giving Arthur actionable, albeit desperate, survival strategies. This not only satisfies the lore demands of the audience, but grounds Arthur's survival in learned knowledge rather than mere luck, reinforcing the theme that in this universe, knowledge is the only currency against the mechanical undead. The successful integration of this expanded lore and heightened physical threat necessitates a careful balancing act regarding the antagonist's intelligence. The sequel must articulate a shift in the animatronic's behavior, moving from the reactive patrolling of the first film to a proactive, coordinated strategy that suggests a centralized intelligence guiding the hunt. This might be personified by the puppet, not just as a passive spiritual presence, but as the orchestrator employing the withered animatronics as specialized tools. For instance, Foxy might be used as a relentless distraction on one side of the building, drawing Arthur's limited power resources there, while Mangle, utilizing the ventilation system far more effectively than previously seen, attempts a flanking maneuver from above. This strategic deployment transforms the horror from random encounters into a meticulously planned siege, showcasing an evolution in the antagonist's capabilities that mirrors the technological advancements implied by the sequel's production scale. Arthur's emotional breaking point should coincide with this strategic escalation. The professional veneer must shatter when he realizes the attacks are not merely random system failures, but personalized responses to his actions. If he attempts to use sound cues, like broadcasting a loud, looping sound file in one room hoping to draw an animatronic away, and the machines counter by immediately quieting down their ambient noise in that sector, showing they have learned to filter or ignore his specific tactic, the realization of their adaptive intelligence will induce true despair. This moves the narrative into existential horror. The machines are not just driven by residual emotion. They are learning tactical deception. The film should capture this moment with stark visual isolation. Perhaps Arthur is alone in the suddenly silent main office, illuminated only by the cold blue light of the inactive monitors, his breath fogging the screen as he processes the fact that he is being outthought. Furthermore, the sequel must address the theme of cyclical suffering inherent in the franchise. If Arthur survives, his victory cannot feel complete. A powerful final sequence might involve him discovering evidence that the original restaurant owner, or perhaps a recurring figure from Fazbear Entertainment's executive board, deliberately engineered the conditions for this very survival test, perhaps viewing the night guards as necessary sacrifices or even subjects for experimentation. This dark implication, that Arthur was never meant to simply survive, but was being tested to see if a new method of containment or control over the possessed entities could be developed, would tie his personal failures, his law enforcement career, directly into the grander ongoing tragedy of the Fazbear legacy. The lingering shot, as Arthur walks out into the dawn, should not be one of relief, but of chilling uncertainty, as he glances back at the pizzeria, aware that his survival only confirms the villain's hypothesis, and that another cycle, with a new guard, is inevitable. The narrative sophistication required for Five Nights at Freddy's 2 compels a deeper exploration of the underlying mythology, specifically regarding the origins of the agony fueling the animatronics. If the sequel aims for emotional resonance beyond simple gore, it must personify the soul-trapping mechanism. We might see the introduction of a character, perhaps a geriatric former employee, or a disgraced technician named Silas, who operates in the periphery. A ghost in the corporate machine who knows too much. Silas wouldn't be a direct helper like a typical mentor figure. Instead, his interactions with Arthur would be cryptic, driven by a decades-old guilt, perhaps communicating solely through coded maintenance reports or delivering essential but terrifyingly incomplete pieces of information about the rituals or failures that bound the children to the metal shells. His motivation wouldn't be heroism, but a desperate need to see the cycle acknowledged before his own inevitable demise, adding a layer of Shakespearean tragedy to the lore dumps. The portrayal of the toy animatronics, if they feature as an upgraded, less physically decayed threat compared to the withered group, must emphasize their uncanny valley effect. While the withered ones are clearly haunted corpses, the toys should represent a more insidious form of possession, souls forced into pristine, aggressively cheerful casings. Imagine Toy Bonnie's movements being too fluid, too perfectly timed, suggesting an entity that has achieved a higher degree of mimicry of human action, making its eventual bursts of violence feel like a sophisticated mask, slipping rather than a primal rampage. Arthur's increasing paranoia would manifest as an inability to trust even the silence. He would question whether the pristine shine of a toy animatronic is a sign of safety or an indicator that this particular entity has successfully suppressed its inner turmoil, making it the most dangerous of all, because it appears almost sane. The climax of Arthur's ordeal should pivot around a confrontation that isn't about brute force, but about recognizing the specific, personalized torment of one of the spirits. If one of the lost children was particularly attached to a certain toy or concept, the puppet or another primary entity might leverage this against Arthur, perhaps forcing him to choose between restoring power to a critical monitor or preventing a specific area from being locked down, a choice that directly mirrors a past trauma of the child spirit. This forces Arthur, the man who tried to escape his own past mistakes through rigorous procedure, to make an emotionally devastating, illogical choice. The resolution of this emotional hurdle, rather than the escape from the building, should grant him his temporary reprieve. The lingering sense of dread will then stem from the knowledge that he didn't defeat the evil. He merely appeased one facet of it, leaving the larger corporate monstrosity intact and waiting for the next shift. The narrative's sustained effectiveness relies on grounding the supernatural escalation in tangible, sensory detail, pushing the audience's empathy for Arthur further into the abyss. If Silas, the spectral technician, provides clues, those clues must be physically manifested within the environment. Perhaps Arthur finds Silas's old personalized toolkit, one heavy wrench inexplicably covered in dried, iridescent purple residue, matching the faint glow occasionally seen near the main control panel, suggesting that containment attempts were not purely mechanical, but bordered on the occult. This visual continuity reinforces the notion that the supernatural and the technical are inextricably linked in this universe, a core theme inherited from Cawthon's blending of childhood horror with complex engineering puzzles. Furthermore, the depiction of the building itself must function as a psychological extension of the spirit's torment. The sequel could introduce recurring environmental glitches that target Arthur's professional skepticism. For instance, temperature fluctuations might become erratic in specific zones. Freezing cold in a hallway where a child was supposedly last seen, contrasted sharply with oppressive, suffocating heat near the main stage, hinting at localized pockets of spiritual energy density. Arthur, attempting to use an infrared scanner, would register impossible heat signatures or sudden, absolute drops to absolute zero, forcing him to abandon empirical observation in favor of pure instinct. His reliance on data, his last bastion of control, would be systematically dismantled by a haunting that defies measurable physics. The character arc for Arthur must culminate not in bravery, but in a harrowing form of acceptance. His final stand should not be about overpowering the robots, but about surviving long enough to pass on a critical piece of damning evidence against Fazbear Entertainment. A hidden server log, perhaps, accessible only during the final moments of the night when the power grid temporarily overloads. This shifts the ultimate victory from personal survival to a moral imperative, reflecting a mature directorial choice to broaden the scope of the conflict beyond the security booth. If Arthur manages to upload this information via a weak, intermittent signal just as the sun crests the horizon, his escape is tainted. He is a damaged courier of truth, forever marked by the metallic embrace of the pizzeria. The final shots should linger on the exterior of the building, now bathed in morning light, looking deceptively benign, implying that the true horror, the systemic corruption of Fazbear Entertainment, remains untouchable and operational, ready for the next installment. The narrative weight now shifts towards the inescapable legacy of the pizzeria, suggesting that survival is not merely escaping the building before dawn, but successfully breaking the cycle of silence that protects the corporation. Arthur's realization that he is merely a pawn in a larger, ongoing experiment necessitates an almost desperate attempt to document the tangible evidence Silas hinted at. This documentation must be physically risky. Perhaps the critical server Arthur needs to access is located in a sub-level maintenance area, a space deliberately designed without camera coverage, forcing Arthur into the one scenario he has desperately tried to avoid: unmonitored physical confrontation with the antagonists. This underground environment should feel qualitatively different from the brightly colored yet decaying areas above. Damp, smelling of mildew and ozone, suggesting the very foundations of the building are corrupt, mirroring the rot within Fazbear's corporate structure. The engagement with the antagonists in this low-light, resource-scarce environment must highlight their individual specialties. If Mangle remains primarily an aerial or duct-based threat, its presence here should involve dropping down unexpectedly onto precarious platforms, forcing Arthur to utilize climbing or balancing maneuvers that completely undermine his security guard training. Meanwhile, the withered animatronics might exhibit a strange coordination, not necessarily working in unison, but patrolling in a manner that effectively herds Arthur towards the server room, almost as if they are being directed by a master puppeteer who understands the optimal path to achieving the desired outcome. Either Arthur's death or his success in retrieving the specific data they want exposed. This suggests a complicated spiritual dynamic, where the children's rage might occasionally align with a desire for revelation, pitting them momentarily against the corporate overseers. The emotional climax concerning the children's spirits needs refinement. If Arthur successfully accesses the server, the data shouldn't be cold figures. It should be fragmented audio logs of the victims themselves, perhaps cries for help or innocent statements cut short by sudden mechanical noise. Experiencing these first-hand auditory ghosts, hearing the essence of the tragedy he is fighting to expose, should emotionally shatter Arthur's professional detachment, replacing it with a deep, empathetic anger. This empathetic connection validates the horror experience for the audience, confirming that the violence is rooted in genuine loss, not just mechanics. This moment of shared grief could be the key to temporarily incapacitating the entities, as the intensity of the raw emotion might overload their corrupted programming, causing a momentary system freeze where Arthur can finally upload the critical files. The aftermath of Arthur's escape, assuming he achieves it, cannot offer traditional catharsis. He leaves not just physically exhausted, but spiritually scarred, burdened by the intimate knowledge of the suffering he witnessed. The closing sequence should focus on the dissemination of the evidence, a blurry encrypted data packet landing in the inbox of an investigative journalist or a regulatory body. The final shot of Arthur, perhaps watching a news report several weeks later about an impending investigation into Fazbear Entertainment, should show a man who has found a new, grim purpose. His paranoia remains, however, evidenced by his refusal to look at reflections or dark corners, understanding that while the immediate threat of that specific night has passed, The systemic evil he exposed is far larger, and it will undoubtedly seek retribution, setting the stage for a third chapter where the hunters become the hunted on a corporate scale. The narrative thread demands a visceral representation of the corporation's desperate attempts to contain both the mechanical failure and the legal fallout, making the sequel a battle not just for survival, but for the control of narrative truth. If Arthur manages to expose the data, Fazbear Entertainment's response, even if delayed, must feel imminent and powerful. This could manifest early in the final act through a new, ostensibly helpful character. A corporate liaison, perhaps a slick, unnervingly composed young executive named Evelyn, sent under the guise of asset recovery or structural assessment immediately after the most intense phase of the haunting. Evelyn's role is to observe Arthur's performance, to gauge how much he knows, and subtly manipulate the scene to look like a conventional break-in or a breakdown, neutralizing the evidence Arthur has painstakingly collected. Evelyn's character is a crucial counterpoint to Arthur's raw fear. She embodies the sanitized, corporate face of evil, a chilling contrast to the monstrous, exposed machinery of the animatronics. Her dialogue would be laced with saccharine corporate jargon, describing unimaginable horrors as unforeseen asset depreciation or necessary termination of liability. When Arthur tries to convey the supernatural events, Evelyn responds with clinical skepticism, suggesting stress-induced hallucinations, thereby weaponizing the protagonist's own psychological fragility against him. This introduces a human antagonist who leverages plausibility against the impossible truth Arthur holds. The final confrontation should integrate Evelyn's presence with the spirit's actions. Perhaps, as Arthur is about to transmit the final package of evidence, Evelyn attempts to physically intervene. At this moment, the spiritual entities, driven by the pure, unadulterated rage that Evelyn's corporate apathy seeks to erase, turn their attention to her. It should not be an attack of malice, but a violent manifestation of the haunting directed at the representative of the system that ignored their suffering. The withered animatronics could corner Evelyn, not attempting to kill her immediately, but to physically overwhelm her with the evidence of their existence, tearing at her pristine suit, exposing the rot beneath the veneer of corporate polish. This moment serves as a dark thematic payoff. The mechanical monsters, for once, align with the truth, demonstrating a primitive form of justice against the human architect of their neglect. Arthur's concluding action, therefore, becomes less about personal escape and more about ensuring Evelyn's forced confession or incapacitation is recorded. He must choose the right moment to capture the image of the unmasked corporate evil being confronted by the very ghosts it created. His survival is secured not by defeating the robots, but by witnessing this pivotal, chaotic confluence of supernatural rage and corporate hypocrisy. The film ends not with a tidy resolution, but with Arthur walking away from a scene of absolute chaos, armed only with irrefutable visual proof that the nightmare is systemic, leaving the audience with the unsettling understanding that the ghosts of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza are now public knowledge. But the corporation itself is too deeply entrenched to be easily destroyed. The incorporation of Evelyn, the corporate liaison, demands a deeper examination of the sequel's pacing, specifically how to sustain high-level tension across multiple antagonistic forces. Her calculated non-supernatural threat should function as a clock running in parallel to the supernatural siege. While Arthur is distracted by the encroaching metallic entities, Evelyn is closing in on his physical location, systematically erasing data trails or subtly tampering with the security system to make Arthur look incompetent or unstable. This dual pressure forces Arthur into impossible triage. Does he divert precious battery power to seal a door against a physically approaching Foxy, or does he use that power to keep the local network online long enough to transmit data before Evelyn remotely locks him out of the system? This mirrors the strategic pressure points found in the later iterations of the game source material, where resource management is layered with deceptive countermeasures. The emotional core of Arthur's final struggle against Evelyn must highlight his regained sense of moral clarity. Having shed his earlier cynical detachment, Arthur should embrace the chaos, recognizing that the only way to defeat Evelyn's calculated narrative is to embrace the undeniable absurdity of the supernatural events. If Evelyn attempts to argue that the lights flickering are due to faulty wiring, Arthur, drawing upon the obscure knowledge gained from Silas, or his own torturous experience, might deliberately trigger a known haunting pattern, perhaps forcing the withered Bonnie's jump scare sequence, specifically to generate an anomalous energy spike that Evelyn cannot rationally explain away to her superiors. This is Arthur weaponizing the paranormal against the purely bureaucratic evil. The climax involving the spirits turning on Evelyn needs careful staging to avoid undermining the animatronics as primary threats. Instead of a direct, sustained assault, it could be a moment of targeted, symbolic exposure. As Evelyn stands over the main server rack, confident in her control, the stage animatronics, perhaps Freddy and Chica, slowly approach. They do not attack her physically, but rather move to systematically destroy the recording devices and external communications equipment she is using to report back to headquarters, isolating her within the horror she disdains. The sounds they make should change in this context. Less mechanical grinding, more distorted, almost mocking laughter synthesized through their vocalizers, signifying their awareness of the corporate deception. The lasting image of Arthur walking away must resonate with the trauma of bearing witness to the truth. He doesn't win a fight, he survives an exposé. The visual of the transmitted data packet, perhaps appearing as a single corrupted file icon on his personal non-work phone screen, serves as his trophy and his curse. The final scene should reveal Arthur living a quiet, almost monastic existence, permanently haunted by the sounds of grinding gears, yet finding grim satisfaction in knowing that the truth is out. The audience is left with the powerful understanding that in the world of Five Nights at Freddy's, true victory is not peace, but the successful transference of horrifying knowledge, ensuring the next battle will be fought in courtrooms and boardrooms, not just security offices. The transition from physical siege to corporate warfare necessitates a narrative pivot, where the true power of the animatronics is revealed to be their spectral persistence, a force capable of disrupting the carefully constructed facade of Fazbear Entertainment that Evelyn represents. Since Arthur has successfully documented the supernatural chaos, the third act must deal with the aftermath of that revelation leaking into the public sphere, creating a scenario where the entities are no longer just haunting a location, but actively influencing public perception and corporate collapse. This suggests a potential setting shift, perhaps not back to the pizzeria, but to a temporary corporate headquarters or a high-security archive where the remnants of Afton Robotics technology are being hastily consolidated following the initial scandal. Arthur, now operating as an informant or perhaps even a reluctant whistleblower, would be under immense psychological strain, perpetually looking over his shoulder for corporate cleanup crews rather than possessed robots. However, the spirits cannot be contained by legal paperwork. Their essence tied to the physical objects and the very land the company occupies must manifest in ways that sabotage Evelyn's damage control. Imagine the withered animatronics, or perhaps smaller, more easily transportable service bots, repurposed by the lingering spirits, appearing within the sterile, glass-walled confines of the corporate offices. These intrusions would be targeted, silencing key witnesses before they can testify, corrupting digital backups of incriminating documents, or displaying horrifying ghostly projections onto the boardroom screens during emergency shareholder meetings. The emotional arc here for Arthur is one of reluctant control. He is no longer reacting out of terror. He is proactively using the malevolence of the hauntings as a weapon against the human villains who orchestrate the secrecy. This requires him to forge an unstable, temporary alliance with the supernatural. He might intentionally leave certain physical artifacts, a specific music box, a faded photograph, in places where he knows the spirits are concentrated, effectively baiting them into creating the necessary chaos to disrupt Evelyn's operations. This interaction should be fraught with moral ambiguity. Arthur is now an active participant in maintaining the horror, albeit for a greater, albeit temporary, good. The audience must feel the weight of his choice to unleash monstrous forces upon cynical executives. The final confrontation should move away from a purely survival setting towards a courtroom or legislative hearing setting, where Arthur presents his evidence, only to have it miraculously discredited by a final, devastating act of spectral sabotage aimed at the corporation's remaining credibility. As Evelyn, or the lead executive, tries to calmly dismiss the evidence as manufactured by a disgruntled former employee, Arthur, the primary antagonist, perhaps Freddy Fazbear, whose face is the recognizable brand, manifests on the main presentation screen via a hacked live feed, not just glitching, but delivering a clear, heartbreaking monologue directly addressing the executives about the suffering of the children. This final, incontrovertible proof forces a moment of systemic breakdown, where the machinery of the law and public opinion can no longer ignore the reality of the haunting. Arthur's victory is secured not by surviving another night, but by ensuring the brand name itself becomes synonymous with unforgivable tragedy, ensuring that Fazbear Entertainment, in its current form, cannot rise again. The culmination of Arthur's struggle, transitioning from localized terror to systemic corporate warfare, hinges on the concept of spectral infiltration. The idea that the haunting possesses an intelligence capable of navigating beyond the physical confines of the pizzeria. If the evidence Arthur transmits is indeed powerful enough to trigger an official inquiry, the next phase must illustrate how the deceased children, or the entity controlling them, directly targets the infrastructure of Fazbear Entertainment's cover-up. This moves the horror into the realm of technological terrorism guided by spiritual entities. The visual language must adapt. Instead of dingy hallways, we see sterile, modern server rooms displaying catastrophic failure. The withered animatronics, perhaps relegated to the background lore, are replaced by smaller, less conspicuous robotic elements. Security drones, automated cleaning units, or even automated customer service interfaces, all subtly reprogrammed by the controlling intelligence. The emotional landscape for Arthur now shifts from fear of physical harm to profound moral compromise. He is actively utilizing malevolent forces, which should leave him deeply unsettled. His collaboration with the ghosts becomes a transactional relationship. When he leaves the specific catalyst, the faded photograph of a child smiling before the tragedy, in a high-security server access point, he is knowingly inviting catastrophic chaos, betting that the resulting destruction will expose the human villains faster than any legal process. This act should be depicted with immense internal conflict. Arthur, the man clinging to procedure, now orchestrates mayhem, acknowledging that only true, unquantifiable horror can combat calculated, human evil. The introduction of the hack during the high-stakes testimony, where Freddy Fazbear's visage appears on the main screen delivering the chilling monologue, must be executed with near-perfect technical precision to feel earned. This isn't a simple video loop. It is the spirit temporarily hijacking complex modern broadcasting technology. The executive's reaction should be one of absolute, unmasking panic, the moment their carefully constructed reality collapses under the weight of verifiable, public supernatural proof. The script of Freddy's message must be brief, poignant, and damning, perhaps simply reciting the names of the missing children with an eerie, digitized inflection, making the tragedy irrefutable and personal to every viewer. Arthur's final, quiet resolution speaks volumes about the genre's thematic core. Sometimes, survival means becoming a permanent outsider burdened by truth. The image of him watching the news report, showing the stock prices plummeting and Evelyn being escorted away amidst flashing lights, should be juxtaposed with a deeply personal sign of haunting. Perhaps the only thing he kept from the experience is a small, dented flashlight that inexplicably turns on for a single, weak second in the dead of night, even though its batteries were removed weeks ago. This subtle, residual haunting confirms that while Fazbear Entertainment as a corporation may have been dismantled, the spiritual residue, the cycle of grief and trauma, attaches itself to those who dared to look too closely. He achieved justice, but at the cost of his own peace, forever living under the spectral shadow of his experience. The enduring consequence of Arthur's victory over Fazbear Entertainment must be explored through the lens of paranoia and the normalization of the horrific. If the haunting has successfully crippled the corporation, the threat doesn't simply vanish. It metastasizes into Arthur's daily life, becoming the ultimate form of character scarring. The quiet life he attempts to build, perhaps a remote job monitoring traffic cameras or archival data entry, is constantly undermined by a hypervigilance bordering on psychosis. He no longer fears the location of the ghosts, but their ubiquity. He sees the patterns everywhere, the uneven spacing of parked cars mirroring the withered animatronics' patrol routes, the flicker of a faulty street lamp triggering an adrenaline spike that matches the panic of the main office power drain. This heightened state of awareness introduces the final, most insidious antagonist, the lingering influence of Afton's corrupted engineering philosophy. Arthur might begin to notice that the technology he interacts with, even in ostensibly safe environments, possesses subtle, almost invisible flaws, suggesting that the foundational principles of Afton's design, the melding of robotics and the paranormal, have seeped into broader industrial standards. For example, a self-checkout machine at a grocery store might briefly display the distorted image of the puppet's face, before defaulting back to its normal screen. Or a new, seemingly harmless automated home assistant might begin whispering fragmented lullabies when Arthur is alone. This suggests that the spiritual infection is not contained to Fazbear property. It is a fundamental design flaw in the very infrastructure of modern convenience built upon those early tainted patents. Arthur's emotional response to this omnipresent threat evolves from active fear to a resigned, almost weary acceptance of his role as a perpetual Cassandra. He can no longer effectively fight. His only recourse is insulation. He might develop elaborate rituals to ward off these subtle intrusions, using only non-digital tools, surrounding himself with white noise generators to mask anomalous audio cues, or relying on analog technology despite its inefficiency. This emphasizes the tragic irony of his character. A man who sought stability through professionalism is forced to embrace superstition and ritual to survive the reality he exposed. His success in bringing down Fazbear has only revealed the terrifying scope of the underlying problem, leaving him isolated, the sole sane man aware that the world is subtly malfunctioning around him. The narrative conclusion must offer a moment of ambiguous confrontation that acknowledges this lingering threat. Perhaps Arthur is visiting a public park, a symbol of normalcy and open space, when he notices a child's forgotten brightly colored balloon caught high in the branches of a tree. As he watches, the balloon doesn't simply float away. It is gently guided down, landing perfectly at his feet, seemingly pushed by an invisible, gentle hand. There is no grinding gear, no jump scare, just a quiet, unnerving courtesy. This final gesture confirms that the entity, perhaps the primary soul within the puppet, recognizes Arthur not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a necessary catalyst, a conduit through which the truth was released. The final frame should show Arthur gently picking up the balloon, his face a complex mixture of lingering terror and profound, exhausted understanding. He didn't defeat the horror, he became its designated, albeit unwilling caretaker in the public eye, forever tied to the tragedy he uncovered. Hello everyone and welcome to the FrameFlow channel. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Today, we are going to be discussing the movie Five Nights at Freddy's 2, 2025. The flickering neon sign of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza blasted a sickly yellow light onto the rain-slicked asphalt. Jeremy Fitzgerald,